we had Sir Oliver Letwin this morning with us, sharing his views in a private discussion group on an upcoming book of his, on the future of the global order, on the East and the West. And we couldn't let go of the chance of having him here also discussing in real time what's happening back in London, an issue where he's been deeply involved with, Brexit, and the terms of the discussion of how the UK will part ways with the European Union. And in many ways it's actually real time, because I think as of 2 minutes ago, 11 judges in London are getting together at the Supreme Court to discuss a motion. And I think therefore we'll be with our eyes on the phones, but in many ways, I think it's also something which is not very factually saying, not very important. So we'll try to keep a big picture, discuss really in line with our interests here at Brookings India, the discussion about Europe and the future of Europe and the European Union, to keep the discussion a bit larger and a bit macro in terms of the future of Britain, the future of the European Union, the future of the relationship between the European Union and Britain, and most importantly, the relationship between the United Kingdom and India. And it's a great pleasure to host Sir Oliver Letwin here for this discussion, and also former Foreign Secretary and former High Commission to London, Ambassador Ranjan Matai, both of which I think will share with us their perspectives on this relationship. And so if I may start with you. You've been very involved in this. You are no longer Conservative Member of Parliament as of a month ago, I think, or a few weeks ago. You're known as a rebel in that Parliament, which is actually not sitting these days. And we're getting close to October 19th. We're getting close to October 31st, and the possibility of a no deal, which would be, at the best, a crisis and a challenge for both the EU and Britain. So let me just read out actually your last ever tweet of August 28, when you say this is not a proper way to proceed. You mentioned it in suspension of Parliament coming up. I expect that Parliament will respond the only way it can by legislating next week, which we actually ended up doing, before it is prorogued, to prevent a disorderly, undemocratic no-deal exit on October 31st. I shall certainly be supporting that effort. What would an orderly, democratic exit look like, please?
Orderly is easy to describe and fairly uncontroversial, in the sense that if there is a state like the UK, which is a member of the EU, and it wishes to leave the EU, there is a process under Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union for doing that. And that process involves negotiating first a withdrawal agreement, and subsequently, after withdrawal, a framework for a future relationship. And the previous Prime Minister, Theresa May, negotiated such a withdrawal agreement, and an orderly process for leaving simply means the conclusion and ratification of the withdrawal agreement, which makes provision for the disentangling of an enormous number of legal relationships between the member state and the EU. And in our case would have meant, and would still mean if one gets signed before the end of October, a 2-year transition period during which the trading relationship would remain exactly as it has been, and a future framework for the trading relationship would be negotiated during that 2-year period. And so it would be a smooth, seamless transition from being a member to being not a member but under the same set of rules, to being not a member and under a new set of rules that have been agreed in the new international treaty. And I mean, as you may know, I've been amongst those who have been in favour repeatedly. I voted 3 times for a withdrawal agreement that was negotiated by the previous Prime Minister. I personally voted to remain in the EU during the referendum, but I accepted that that wasn't the majority vote, and if there's an orderly withdrawal agreement and a transitional period, that's fine with me. It may be suboptimal, but it's perfectly acceptable. When the public, we now come to the question, what is it to have a democratic withdrawal process? This is much more contentious. On the ballot paper in the referendum, there were only two possibilities, remain or leave. Remain was an unequivocal proposition. It was to remain a member of the EU on the terms that the EU already had with us. Leave, of course, turned out not to be an unequivocal proposition. Two views of what the leave vote meant have been fostered by two different sets of people since the referendum. One view was the view which was the predominant view of those who were campaigning to leave in the referendum, namely that it would be easy to sign an advantageous long-term new relationship with the EU, that there would be no difficulty about the withdrawal agreement, that it would all be perfectly smooth.
Soft Brexit.
Of some kind, but I mean, I'm not here speaking of the advocates of Remain, I'm speaking of the advocates of leave. So Mr. Farage, for example, kept on talking about Norway and Switzerland, countries that have very deep free trading relationships with the EU. Another view, subsequently after the referendum espoused, for example, by Mr. Farage, has been that actually a leave vote meant leave on whatever terms those who voted for leave, including in particular whoever it is that's doing the speaking, thought were good terms, or else leave without any relationship whatsoever and with no deal whatsoever, and hence with considerable disruption of various kinds. And it's entirely open to question what for 52% of the population or so who voted leave meant by this. I think, in fact, there's no doubt that some meant one thing and some meant another. How many in which kind, who knows? But given that the majority was 52-48, to people like me anyway, it seems unlikely that there was a majority in favour of leaving without a deal in a disorderly way. We don't know, we can't prove that, but we don't accept that the leave vote gave a mandate to any government to leave on that basis. So whereas I and many others have been willing to vote for almost any kind of orderly deal, we maintain that it's not either democratic or sensible for the country to leave without a deal. And the only way I could see of legitimating leaving without a deal would be to have a second referendum in which that was explicitly on the ballot paper and people voted for it. In that case, I would have to accept that is what the people of Britain want to do, and I think it would be very silly of them, but I would accept it.
So the current Prime Minister's position, which you defined to me earlier, is pretty much a disorderly, undemocratic position, saying no deal.
That is my view, and that's one of the reasons why I'm not currently a member of the Conservative Party, because he and I have come to a profound difference of view, and on my side of the argument lie quite a large number of former ministers and cabinet ministers like myself, and on his side of the argument lie another group of people inside the Conservative Party. There is a split in the Conservative
And that's
Party.
not just a tactical negotiation strategy he's using to pressure Brussels, in your view. It's actually the end objective for him as of October 31st.
Well, I think it certainly was his objective up to the time we passed this law. My impression is that since the time when we passed this law, he has become concerned that the law would in fact be effective, as I believe it will be, that therefore we wouldn't leave on the 31st of October, and therefore I think he has in the last couple of weeks actually tried seriously to get a deal. My impression, but it's only an impression, is that he's encountering quite significant difficulties in doing that, which are in fact relearning the experience that Mrs. May had in trying to do a deal. I don't personally believe that Mrs. May's difficulties arose from some problem with Mrs. May. I think they arose from the problems of the real world. I don't want to go into the detail unless you want to go into it, but the truth is that the triangle of forces of the Anglo-Irish agreement, the EU requirements for the integrity of the single market, and the requirement of my colleagues in the so-called European Reform Group, the most extreme leave group within the Conservative Party and the Brexit Party, Mr. Farage, for not having any entanglement of any part of the UK, including Northern Ireland, in any kind of thing that looks like a customs union with the EU, even for a period, that those three points on the triangle are very difficult to reconcile with one another. And I think that the present Prime Minister is simply rediscovering the difficulty of that. Now, it may be, I profoundly hope it will be, that he finds a resolution of that in the next 2 weeks or so, but time is short and the learning curve has been steep and the difficulty is real. So my sense is he began by thinking that he was going to leave without a deal on the 31st of October. He started trying to get a deal under circumstances where it is proving difficult. I think the great likelihood, therefore, is we will reach the 31st of October without a deal having been signed, and that there will then be an extension. And at that point, I think there will either be a general election or a referendum.
So, in many ways, what you portray as a deep crisis and changed circumstance in the last few months explains also why you changed your position. You were talking about this over lunch again, in which I see statements of yours till early this year saying a deal is important, any deal is very important. At this point, I see there's a bit more pragmatic, the circumstances demand a different attitude in many ways, and a different approach to what's becoming an increasingly, polarized system in Parliament, beyond Parliament, as we speak today, the Supreme Court itself. My question would be on this going forward now, worst case and best case scenario. If you could just from your perspective line out what you see as literally in the next 4 to 5 weeks, what's the worst case scenario October 31st, what's the best case scenario?
Well, from my point of view, the best case scenario by far is that the Prime Minister succeeds in arriving at a deal which is acceptable to the EU and which can gain majority support in Parliament. I will vote for almost any deal that he brings back from the EU, probably literally any deal.
That's sort of what James Corbyn said yesterday. Any deal is better than no deal.
He did say that, though he has opposed all the deals I voted for, which means that it's difficult to know whether he will vote for another one. Some of us are omnivorous. We'll vote for any deal. Others are pickier on deals, especially if they come from a Conservative government. It's a complicated scenario here. We're dealing with the interaction of party politics with national interest. It's very complicated, inevitably. But anyway, from my point of view, the best scenario would be that he comes back with a deal, I vote for the deal, enough other MPs vote for the deal to get the deal through, we have the deal, end. That's the best for me.
Not likely.
I fear not likely. Possible, but not likely. The worst scenario, from my point of view, is that we have no deal. We have what I think will occur, I don't think it's a question of scenario, which is an extension. And we don't resolve this by the 31st of January. And therefore, actually, we leave without a deal on the 31st of January, which is no better than, in fact, in some ways worse, than leaving on the 31st of October without a deal. The disruption of leaving without a deal occurs whenever it happens, and if you're going to do it, you might as well do it earlier rather than later, I guess. And what would follow from that? Who knows? This is all an issue of risk and not of certainty. It's one of the things that makes it so difficult to talk about politically, because if you try to appear on a TV program or a radio program and to explain in a few seconds a situation where you are not stating certainties but outlining risks, that's a very difficult democratic proposition, because it's just, our discourse just isn't good at handling things which are uncertain. So it could be,
especially with the prospect of new elections on the horizon.
Indeed, but I mean, it could be that if you leave without a deal, actually everyone is very sensible and it all turns out more or less okay, and you later work out a perfectly sensible relationship. That is a possibility. Another possibility is everyone is very silly and it's very, very difficult for a few weeks. There are a lot of things going wrong and a lot of people are very miserable. Probably not with any very great short-term economic effect. We had a fuel tanker strike in the UK. I think you may have been the High Commissioner at the time, which almost paralysed the Blair government. No, you weren't. In fact, you were Foreign Secretary at the time. Anyway, we had a fuel tanker dispute. It had no economic effect, but for a few days people couldn't fill their cars. and it almost paralysed the government. There's a similar possibility for a few weeks after a no-deal exit if certain people the other side of the channel behave in certain ways which are uncontrollable. On top of that, there are more serious dislocations to our industrial base which may occur. It may be very difficult, for example, to export cars to the EU at prices people will pay for them. And on top of that, there may be some very serious difficulties with in Scotland and in Northern Ireland, which may lead to the breakup of the UK. So the worst case scenario is we get to January the 31st, there is a no-deal exit after all because for one reason or other we haven't resolved this, or there's been a general election and it's led to a government that wants a no-deal exit and it gets it, and it all goes wrong, and there is a lot of disruption, maybe followed by another general election, a dissolution of the union, and some quite severe industrial damage. That's the worst case. I have to say, having said all that, looking at it from several thousand miles away, if you ask the question, 30 years from now, how different will the relationship between India and the UK in trading or economic terms really be? And how different in the end will the UK's relationship to the EU be, and to EU regulation and to immigration policy in the UK and so on? I have to say, I think the answer is probably, ironically, at the end of all of this terrible trauma, not that great.
On that hopeful note, sir, you know the UK as few people know in this town. You've served twice there. Once as Deputy High Commissioner in 2000s, as High Commissioner between 2013 and late 15, as these debates were beginning to take place in London on Brexit and the future of the relationship between the UK and EU. What is your view, and what is the view from Delhi on this wonderful crisis? In
just before you answer, Ambassador, may I just say that I've just received notification that the Supreme Court ruled the prorogation to be unlawful, unanimously, and that it never happened.
Okay.
So Parliament is actually, I think, as of this moment, sitting, although I'm in the
You're saying
wrong part of the world.
No, even the current one is not.
If he tries to do so on the same basis, he will be doing so unlawfully.
Yes.
They have ruled in a way that has deprived the Crown of the ability to prorogue except for certain specific circumstances. It's a very dramatic judgment.
It is.
Yes, sir, please.
In fact, this judgment, I think, really brings to the fore very many more profound issues, but those are constitutional and related to the UK's, the way the UK runs itself. So I won't go there. But I think I broadly agree with the way Oliver has laid out the scenario. But there's one significant point which I think we need to keep in mind, and that is, if you look at the way in which the previous Prime Minister did, in all seriousness and I believe in good faith, try to negotiate a deal, try to reach out to the maximum the EU wanted, which was not acceptable in her own parliament, you're coming to the conclusion now, and one of Oliver's successors as the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, you have to tell us someday what that means, said, we are reaching the stage where the EU dictates whether we can leave or not, and on what terms we can leave. And that is bringing up questions. For him, it was a matter of the Conservative Party about to face collapse. For me, that's not relevant. The issue is, where is national sovereignty in all this? And we need to remember that part of the thrust for going in for the referendum was a determination to pull back a certain amount of sovereign powers. So we are in this phase of nationalism all over the world, and so I think there's an element which we should not lose sight of, and that is, for all their mistakes, for all their sometimes buffoonery, some of the Brexit campaigners are actually standing for something which many other people in this world also believe very, very strongly in, that is in national sovereignty. So I think this judgment, I think, is certainly a setback for them, but I think they will find some way and try to force this issue. But looking at it from India's perspective, we have a very, very strong, very ancient relationship with the United Kingdom, and I think that will continue irrespective of what form the Brexit takes, whether it happens, whether they actually succeed in forcing another referendum. Somehow the EU is very good at this. If you look at the history, in France, in Netherlands and Ireland, you had majorities voting against what the EU wanted. And in due course of time, with sheer persistence, the EU managed to claw back and have a second referendum and force those populations to change their vote. So it's happened before, but I'm not suggesting that it will. What I'm trying to get at is, I think the Indian relationship will remain very strong with the United Kingdom, and we certainly hope it remains the United Kingdom, irrespective of what form the Brexit takes. The stakes are very, very deep, very old. There is, of course, the fact that many of the Indian very large investments in the UK were predicated on the possibility of using Europe as a market, but I think they will work through that, and whatever form of relationship ultimately the UK works out with Europe. And by and large, the industrial groups all feel that agriculture and cars are the two outliers right now. Everything else should be back to normal fairly soon. So that relationship will continue. What will be interesting is how the rest of the EU will carry on after this. We have the possibility of signing an FTA with the EU. The EU has to pull itself together. There are some very interesting pointers coming out of the EU, that it is taking account of some of this nationalist upsurge in its own membership. I don't know how many of you saw, there is a controversy going on right now over Ursula von der Leyen's designation of the Commissioner for Immigration as the Commissioner for European Values. There's a deep significance in that, cultural values, the sense of, again, identity forcing its way into politics.
The European way of life.
Yes, the European way of life. So I think it will be a very, I think, high priority for the EU once Brexit happens, and I think it will happen, to quickly make sure that among the major trading partners, there isn't too much sense that this one disruption within us is going to cause any disruption externally. So to that extent, I expect to see some progress towards a negotiation with India on an FTA. So I think on the whole, whatever
UK
form,
you mentioned, or EU?
no, the
Both.
EU. With the UK, I think we will be able to move fairly quickly towards working out a trade agreement, and the UK will certainly need it, because otherwise WTO rules will kick in, and so it would be in their interest, and certainly I think for a lot of Indians there would be great interest in signing very quickly with the UK.
So it sounds like there's space, or actually that's already happening, for various Europe policies here in Delhi. You can have a relationship with the UK.
Yes.
Let's not forget the Commonwealth also, which is becoming more active and more
Mm.
important. You can have a relationship with France and Germany. Both relationships which are very strong these days, with France in particular, even on defense and security issues. And with the EU 27 without Brexit. So it sounds again quite optimistic.
Yeah, I don't see that much disruption in the relationship with India. What happens in its relationships with other countries, it's interesting if you look at the attitudes of some of the major powers towards Brexit. Mr. Donald Trump seems to be an open supporter of Britain moving out. Mr. Putin also is, and he has encouraged the British to go for Brexit. The Chinese have been a bit circumspect. They have traditionally, in 2015 when I was there, Xi Jinping actually pitched for Britain to remain in the EU, and I think for the Chinese it's more part of their Eurasian strategy that a European pole is important for this whole Belt and Road and linking up the whole of Eurasia. Britain was not central to it. Germany is, France probably is, and the Visegrad group with whom they have developed a special relationship, that certainly is. If this pole were to continue, the Chinese would, I think, have no problem with Brexit. But as of now, I think officially they would prefer a EU not in turmoil, and certainly no disorderly Brexit. Uh, some others, very interesting. Mr. Netanyahu is a very strong supporter of Brexit. Curious one that, but he is. Among the other powers in the world, the Japanese have been very quiet. Traditionally, their companies, and I have been in London and I know how they feel, have that same sense of worry about what happens to our major investments which are in the UK because these require the European market. I think if they were assured cars will be a problem.
Similar to Indian concerns you mentioned.
Similar,
Japanese
yes. But otherwise, they are reasonably sanguine that they can live with either scenario.
So why do we have this abnormality of having an Indian Prime Minister who's also not supportive of Brexit?
I'm not so sure.
Compared to the other leaders you mentioned.
I think by and large, the Prime Minister took the view that this is a matter internal. It was an internal debate going on when he arrived in 2015, at least when I was there. And certainly we have been always cautious about not implanting ourselves in the middle of other people's national debates because we don't like that in our scenario here in India. So I think to that extent we are a little circumspect. But if you notice, some of the strongest supporters of Brexit include members of the Indian community in the UK. The Home Secretary right now, who is one of the people in the party who stood up very strongly, is somebody who is well connected here in Delhi. And so there is an understanding and sympathy for both points of view.
Could it also be that India, by instinct, by experience, favors a strong, united and stable Europe, particularly now that we're seeing disorder, uncertainty at the global stage, the US-China rivalry competition? For the first time, somehow I sense in the last few years, you have a sense here in Delhi that a strong, cohesive Europe is of strategic importance to India. And therefore the importance of a good deal between the UK and the EU, which assumes a working relationship on trade, on mobility, on standards, but also on security issues.
Yeah, I think our position
that favors
there
Indian interests.
is similar to the Chinese of 10 years ago, because we favor a multipolar world. And having Europe as a credible alternative pole, a credible source of global finance, of global soft power, of global science, science and technology that can make a difference to people's lives around the world. Yes, I think to that extent, the pooling together of European capabilities is something which we see as of very great importance to our own national interest. The Chinese have evolved, because from the time they wanted a multipolar world, I think they've moved to thinking of a G2, and all the others are also RANs. But certainly for us in India, this kind of an alternate pole does not exclude the possibility that Britain could be outside it and continue to wield an influence in what you could call an Anglosphere or a wider English-speaking world, a Commonwealth, and
Or
so on.
Europe, or a stronger Europe.
A stronger Europe is separate. What I'm saying is we can live with a stronger Europe in which Britain is not a part and find our national interest in both.
Sir, coming back to your last point about 20, 30 years from now, you say you suspect this, whatever happens over the next few months will not deeply affect the UK and the relationship. Could you play out how you see that relationship, assuming Brexit takes place in one form or the other in the next few weeks?
Well, I mean, I broadly agree with what the Ambassador was saying. It seems to me that the big picture question is what role Europe as a whole, including the UK inside or outside the EU, plays in the great question of the relationship between the US, China, India, the ASEAN countries, the rest of the world. And I don't think in that respect whether the UK is inside the EU or is outside the EU is terribly significant, or is likely to be terribly significant. I think what does matter quite a lot to that is how the EU itself evolves, with or without the UK, and what strategic positioning in that global context Europe as a whole decides to adopt. First of all, in relation to trade. I mean, one of the advantages of the UK being within the EU has been to date that it has resisted persistently, alongside frequently Germany and some of the Scandinavian countries, but in contrast to many of the Mediterranean countries and France, it has resisted the tendencies of the EU to build fortresses around its activities through trade restriction. It's been, the UK and Germany have been the leading powers inside the EU in favour of more open trade, the GATT rounds, all of that. And it would have quite a considerable effect on the global balances and the prospects for multipolarity, and I entirely share the Ambassador's hope, and I think the sort of general Indian hope, that we do evolve, as you know from this morning, a multipolar world in which we find a way of cooperating, living in peaceful coexistence with one another, rather than allowing there to be a massive encounter between two, an established hegemon and a nascent hegemon in China. And if we're to do that, it's quite important that Europe should feel part of and be part of promoting an open, free trading world. So that in itself will matter. But that could happen with the EU without the UK as well, as long as it pursues that path. Secondly, I think it will be quite significant how far the EU gets absorbed or avoids being absorbed in massive internal debate following whatever happens on Brexit. So Brexit is a small part of a much bigger question, which is, what is the future of the EU? My own feeling is that Macron's vision is likely to predominate, and that it's likely that we will find eventually a resolution in which there is a sort of inner core that becomes more and more like a state, and an outer core that becomes more and more like a free trading area, and I think that is probably quite a stable solution. It's not certain that that's what will happen. If it doesn't happen, I think there might be continuing friction, and it could be that the EU becomes extraordinarily internally preoccupied and therefore fails to fulfill the role in the global scene that it could and should fulfill, of trying to bring together the great moving parts and trying to facilitate a more sensible attitude in Washington to Beijing, and in Beijing to Washington, probably alongside the Indians and others. And so I think the two big issues are, what is the trading stance of the EU going forward, and what is the global ability of Europe to play a part in constructing a stable multipolar world going forward. And those are much more important issues than the question of whether the UK is within, without, has this trading relationship or that trading relationship to the EU. Matters to the UK, but I don't think that terribly matters to the future of the world.
But let me play devil's advocate. I think it would matter. Let me portray a different view here. And speaking to what Ambassador Matai was mentioning, the age of sovereignty these days, right? That there is populism, nationalism, a demand for sovereignty, for reassertion of political independence, a skepticism about multilateralism, regional cooperation, integration. Here's a moment in which the EU matters more than ever. Whether it's going to make it or break it, we don't know. I think your scenarios are justified, but you go to Brussels these days, you're talking about the militarization of the EU, slowly. You're talking about the crisis in the transatlantic relationship. The EU is becoming, at least discussing, and becoming at least the more important actor than ever, possibly more. And exactly at this point, the UK is opting out. At the point in which a transatlantic relationship and your most special relationship of all special relationship with the United States is under crisis, and you have a president in the United States saying that you've become dispensable, that you have to take care of your own security, of your own trading relationships, be part of Europe and not rely on the United States. At this exact point, the UK is moving into this age of sovereignty, into sort of a separatist mode, if you want. To what extent is that actually factual and endangering the UK strategic priorities for the future in terms of being alone or being part of a larger bloc? If you want to call it a post-national bloc, a regional cooperation bloc, but certainly one of those poles in that multipolar world you were playing out first.
Well, I think the first point is, while I completely agree with what the Ambassador was saying about the trend towards nationalism as a form of self-determination in recent years, I think it's it's uncontroversial that that has been happening. I don't think those trends are for keeps. They come and they go. And this particular one, I think, at least in the West, has largely been generated by the after effects of 2008, which has had a very long dated effect on real wages for large parts of the populations of the United States and Western Europe. And that has been combined in a very toxic way with a structural change which has been rippling through the whole world. It's true in India, it's true in China, it's true in Western Europe and the United States as well, which is that the returns to unskilled labour have been going down relative to the returns to skilled labour. So if you are an unskilled labourer in the northeast of England, or the Rust Belt of the United States, or Dusseldorf, it doesn't matter where, you will have seen another set of people who are better educated and have more saleable skills, witnessing very considerable real increases in income. And nowadays you can, even if you're not at all rich, you have an iPhone or something, and you see in numerous social media young people enjoying themselves with champagne at bars, and you're not, and your income's been less than it was in real terms 10 years ago.
So you
and that, I think, is what's
archetypical Brexit
yes,
voter.
yes, but also
and we could be talking
also
about Pittsburgh and the Trump voter.
correct. It's the same. Incidentally, it's the same voter as the voter for the AfD in Germany, for
and these voters
Norbert
come
in
and go.
Austria.
These voters come and go. You're absolutely right. But
Yeah.
the effects of this, I seem
Well-
to hear that you're playing them down, but they seem to
Well, I'm not-
indicate isolationism,
No,
withdrawal
you-
from one of the most effectual regional cooperation experiments in the world in a multipolar.
You're right. These are very powerful political movements, and politicians need to attend to them very carefully and to recognise their force and not to pretend them away. But the task, in my view, leave aside particular ideological emphases and so on, the task of responsible politicians in a liberal democracy from different points on the political spectrum is to find a way of enabling the country to proceed in the interest of the whole nation, acknowledging sufficiently the force of those feelings, but not giving way to them and allowing them to become the dominant feature of the scene that turns the country into something that actually disadvantages those people by
Why not?
narrow nationalism.
But that is interpreting a mandate, not representing.
Correct. I think the role of a responsible democratic politician is not to sit there and watch and abet their country disappearing into some form of chauvinistic nationalism or worse in order to win some popular votes, but of enabling the country as a whole to acknowledge the problem, to try to deal with it internally by whatever means of fiscal or otherwise are necessary to elevate the condition of those who have a genuine grievance, while at the same time preserving a world order that is actually for the benefit of mankind. And I mean, democratic politics is not there to become a kind of megaphone diplomacy for populism. When you mention, Ambassador, that the proponents externally of Brexit include Trump and Putin and Netanyahu, I don't think I could find a better rhetoric for why I am sceptical about this move. These are not the politicians that I respect. Give me any day Obama and Merkel and Cameron.
But at the same time, you have to respect the electorate's wish
yes.
to part ways with the European Union and go into this.
Yes, but that's why I've always been an
separatist
advocate of compromise. And it seems to me you do have to respect democratic pressures, you have to attend to them, you have to be responsible in the ways you try to deal with their origins. You do not have to arrange yourself in such a way that you answer the concerns of the moment by doing things which will exacerbate the problem. Look at South America. For years and years and years, in many South American states, there were genuine democratic grievances of people who had been hard done by and felt that way. Dictators came along or proto-dictators who became dictators, who administered to that feeling, and they ended up by disadvantaging the very people whose feeling they were seeking to express. This is not a responsible way to behave. And There are other ways to behave that are more responsible. You have been very lucky in India that for a very long time now you've had a succession of regimes which have attended to a whole series of, when you come right down to it, much more severe discontents. You had a much, much larger number of people who were much, much poorer. And you've had a succession of regimes that have tried one way and another to elevate their condition, often by doing things which they might not themselves have voted for individually, and to accumulate sufficient degrees of democratic legitimacy at elections to enable that to happen in different, with different ideological emphases as different regimes have succeeded, but that's been the trend in India. It's worked. India is a much richer country today than it was 30 years ago. That was not because you had a succession of people running India who were just doing the irresponsible thing that they thought would get the next vote. It's because there were actually governments that were trying to think relatively strategically about how to improve the condition of the Indian population as a whole. That's our responsibility in Europe, and I think we have to resist the tide of aggressive, chauvinistic nationalism. This is regardless of the Brexit debate, and try to maintain a position which is sufficiently open and sufficiently progressive so that we are actually advancing the condition of those who are complaining rather than just administering to what they think on Wednesday is a good idea.
Great. So let's open up to the floor and take a few questions. We have 15 to 20 minutes. Yes, sir, please. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Audio, my questions to you. While we're talking about all these things, I remember reading a comment by Senator Mitchell when the Anglo-Irish Accord was signed. And he said that he paid compliments to the British bureaucracy and the Irish bureaucracy, how these guys are able to work their way through very difficult, complex issues. I'm just wondering, this issue of backstop, how is it, it's become a bone stuck in the throat for the whole process. How is it that in your system, how it must be finished in terms of larger objective, which I think. Now, the other side of this, of course, is that the Anglo-Irish Accord gets ruptured, it's ripped up. I wonder what the legal implications of that are. But certainly one implication clearly is that there is a group of people in Northern Ireland who actually are given to ways of violence. And one explosion already has taken place. So we don't know how that process, what kind of forces are being unleashed both in Northern Ireland and a consequence of that in the British Isles, in Ireland, and its implications in terms of the UK-US relationship, the FTA and so on and so forth. So, what I'm trying to say is that how is it that something like that wasn't seen? And it became a kind of trying to push it somehow or the other, try to take advantage of the fog and confusion of politicking and alliances and whatever were taking place, these tactical alliances. So that's one issue. And I'm wondering as to how that is to be seen in terms, and it has large implications for us. I mean, if there is resurgence of violence, of terrorism, anything like that there's wider consequences. So my point actually is that how is it that this is not being talked about, even in the British discourse today, as to what the implications of that are? And my second question really is, after Supreme Court judgment, now I guess the Parliament, the House of Commons would be convened quite early, and the entire tactic or the strategy of Boris Johnson, I think it just goes for a toss. And I wonder what the effect of it will be when it's convened, because there's more time for the House of Commons to deliberate and to cogitate or to make things more difficult. As it is, he has no majority in the House of Commons. So I'm just wondering how it's all going to play out and how that scenario is going to be woven into the 31st October deadline that one's talking about. Of course, one other side of that is that if President Macron actually said that why should we keep giving extension to Britain? They can't make up their mind, it's their business. So maybe that could be some way out for the present British Prime Minister. But the fact of the matter is that you have much more confusion now is taking place. Thank you.
Well, I think...
Should we take just one or two more questions?
Oh, okay.
In the back.
So this whole discussion right now, we're focusing on
If you could just identify yourself. Sorry,
Yeah.
Ambassador.
I'm Yogesh Kumar.
Ambassador Kumar.
I'm Vidisha Banerjee. So the focus right now is on Brexit from the British point of view. There is not much discourse what the European Union feels if UK were to move out. I mean, we talk about Macron or other European countries who are opposing or saying, you know, move out, get it over with. But what price will EU pay if Britain were to go out, not only politically but economically? I mean, Britain cannot be a third pole. So if EU is viewed as another pole, multipolar world, how will it weaken the EU? And is the EU going to do anything in this to not just stop Britain from moving out, but also make sure that the other players in the EU don't start going in the same route?
And then third question here.
This is Parminder Singh from Wipro, and we've got significant investments in the UK last now 25 years. One big anxiety that our customers, especially given that financial sector is much more technology now, manufacturing is much more technology now, is what will be the impact of skills, availability of skills in the UK? Are we looking at a disruption which is going to last for a couple of years? Your, I think, remarks on that.
Okay. Well, in relation to the last three questions, your question, yours, Madam in the back, and your second one, I think I can give some very quick and very definitive answers. We then come to the first question that you asked, which is much more complicated. Availability of skills, I think I can confidently predict there will be no noticeable effect at all. One of the ironies of the whole Brexit debate is that it seems to me absolutely clear that the UK economy requires broadly the same skill base that it has at the moment. It will have increasing needs for skill importation, including IT and others, and therefore actually regardless whether we're in the EU, out of the EU, or in any other position, actually successive UK governments will have to legislate, maybe very unpopular, but nevertheless they will have to legislate to ensure that we continue to have the same flow as we've had before. End of. That's a message which would be devastating if it was understood in large parts of the UK, but as a matter of fact, I think it's the truth. So far as the EU feelings on Brexit are concerned, I mean, here we're talking about EU governments, so I have no idea what Madame Pompier in the middle of Dijon feels about it, but if you're asking what is the collective view of current EU governments, opposition parties in the EU, the European Commission and so on, I think the answer is it's not a very important subject. They're much more concerned about some other things. The UK leaving is a bit of a bore, but it's not very much more. If we leave without a deal, it's a bit more of a bore, but it's still not very much of anything. It's only 9% of EU exports, about 7.5 percentage points of which, 3/4 or more, are pretty price inelastic, so it doesn't actually matter very much. And their main concern is to ensure, first of all, that this whole ghastly saga is over so they can get on and think about other things, and secondly, to make sure that it does not have what you were describing at the end, a sort of domino effect. So, in a sense, the nastier it is for the UK, the better, because there's a more deterrent effect on anyone else trying the same thing. So I think the whole thesis, which has been a predominant feature of our debate in the UK, that somehow we matter a lot to the EU, is false. I think it's very straightforward. So far as the Supreme Court judgment is concerned, actually, although I think it will have huge, as the Ambassador was saying, huge long-term ricochet consequences for the development of the unwritten and probably non-existent constitution of the UK, in terms of the Brexit outcome, it probably is totally insignificant because we were going to be assembling anyway in Parliament on the 14th of October. Yes, but without giving you away any details, I can assure you that my colleagues and I across the parties are fully prepared to do everything we need to do between now and the 31st of October from the 14th anyway, so if we can do it a bit earlier, we'll do it a bit earlier, but who cares? We have already achieved the extension that we need to achieve. We will lock that in. I don't think it makes any difference, really. It would have made a difference if they had been able to prorogue in a way that had prevented us passing the law we passed, but actually it facilitated our passing the law by creating a short time scale and enabling us to do it quickly. So I don't think that...
So he stays or he goes, the Prime Minister?
Sorry?
Does he stay or he goes? He's in the minority now. He has also
Well, I think the Prime Minister will be there for the time being. He's not in the minority, really, because if there was a confidence vote for tomorrow, he'd win it.
I see.
I mean, I would vote for him in place of Mr. Corbyn. So I don't think he's got a problem about remaining in post. His problem is about achieving what he was at least seeking to achieve, which was leaving without a deal. That, I think, we have blocked. Now, come to the difficult question, which is the backstop and its implications. I'm sure we shouldn't spend the next 20 minutes having a detailed conversation about all the aspects of the backstop. But I personally believe that this is not a failure of the negotiating teams and the bureaucracies on either side, or if you include the Irish as a third party, three sides. Actually, I know this may sound strange, but actually I think the backstop is quite a good arrangement. And actually, while we're at it, I think a Northern Ireland only version of the backstop would be a perfectly workable arrangement too. The problem lay in the fact that for party political reasons, the Labour Party wasn't willing to vote for it. And for reasons of conviction, though in my view entirely misplaced, a large number of my colleagues in the European Research Group faction of the Conservative Party were not willing to vote for it, and therefore it couldn't get a majority in the House of Parliament. That was the problem. I don't think as a negotiated text it caused a problem. And in fact, some variant of it is, I think, literally the only way you could possibly hope to achieve an orderly withdrawal agreement in advance of having negotiated the future trading relationship. Because the fundamental, comes back to the question of the EU's view of all this, the fundamental concern of the Commission and of most of the Member States was to preserve the integrity of the single market. They, I think, understandably regard the single market as the most notable achievement of the EU to date. And it depends on having a policed external border. Clearly, you cannot have a completely tariff and customs-free zone, which does operate as a single economy. It genuinely does operate that way in traded goods, if you don't police the external borders. You're simply, at that stage, opening yourself to endless asymmetries between you and other WTO partners. So the big question was, how do you stop leakage? And you can only stop leakage at a border. And that means you either have to stop it at the Irish Sea, to the east of Ireland, or at the north-south border between the north and the south of Ireland. There's no other place you can do it. And what the backstop does is simply say, until and unless we have negotiated a final and workable long-term free trading relationship, which controls the flow of goods one way and the other, there will be the same set of rules that there are at the moment, either covering Northern Ireland only or covering Northern Ireland and the UK as a whole, the rest of GB. So I think actually the backstop was not a mistake or a piece of dictation by the EU to the UK. It was the only way that serious diplomats thinking about a serious problem could resolve the ambition of the UK to leave and the requirement of the EU to maintain the single market integrity. And therefore, actually, what Boris is now discovering is the same thing that Mrs. May discovered over quite a long period, which is you've got this triangle of forces. You've got the EU wanting to preserve its integrity. You've got the Irish government not wanting to recreate a border control of the north-south border because of the long history and people being shot there and all the bloodshed you referred to and so on. And you've got a certain number of my colleagues in Parliament who, for one reason or another, are not willing to vote for a solution to that. And that is a triangle of forces extremely difficult to resolve. That's why we're in the crisis we're in.
Ambassador Matai, you comments or
No,
views?
I think that's absolutely well put. It's a triangle of forces. It's not that they didn't anticipate some of these problems, but there was no other formula that could meet the requirements of at least two out of these three. So I think that they did the best they could. But it brings up larger questions also. One is the distinct possibility that if you have a border, you are reopening very, very drastic situation, 69 to 98. There's another formula, which is that the Irish economy is actually still quite heavily tilted towards the UK rather than the rest of the EU. I don't know the percentages exactly, but it's not quite as diffuse a relationship with the UK as in other EU countries. So this lack of a border could mean two things. One, that Northern Ireland over time, if this backstop gets extended, ultimately becomes part of the Republic of Ireland as an economic unit, and how that will match with being part of a sovereign UK is a problem which only the European Research Group can answer. But that's one. But there is another possibility that if the EU were not as successful in maintaining its current integrity, that the Republic of Ireland's economy may in fact gravitate more towards the UK. But that's remote at this point. I think what you have declared as a inability of negotiators to work out is because of one out of these three in the triangle not being willing to compromise. That's the way I see it.
Just one
But
quick
they'll
follow-up.
have to do it. But in response to that question which was asked from there, I would add one thing, that the EU, I don't quite share Oliver's, I think they were a little more worried about the British leaving and its domino effect than they have let on. Because if you see what the state of play in Italy's politics, for example, it opens up the question quite seriously as to whether this may not be related to Britain, but it may be right at the core, one of the original six raising questions about have we actually benefited from being part of the euro and so on, which are very serious questions in Italy. So there is a very, very serious problem there. And as far as the EU's global influence is concerned, I think in trading terms, in financial terms, it will certainly remain as strong a global player as it was. There are two areas where I think it might diminish without Britain. One is in defense, because now it is only France which has truly got a global military presence, and certainly in the field of intelligence, this is something they are going to lose out on. But there was no European integration on that, but there was certainly intelligence sharing.
So, and the paradox in many ways is that exactly at this moment where you could have the opportunity to work on that in Europe, and PESCO is happening, for example, on defense, and there's a slow militarization of the EU, as I mentioned, and securitization of the EU. Very slow, but it's happening. It's exactly at this point that your major asset is opting out.
One of the
in
two,
many ways,
yeah.
you're putting the major one. You're right. In many ways, the UK
Two,
is.
France and UK.
France comes a second, I'd say, but the UK has been the major one. And on the other hand, sir, in many ways, to what extent does it complicate the relationship? Does it uncomplicate the relationship? You know, you could argue that in many ways the UK has never been deeply involved in the EU integration process. It's always been a reluctant, skeptical actor from the beginning, and therefore this in many ways, opens up new possibilities. And so just two last questions for you, for 1 minute each, sir.
Just a follow-up.
Yeah,
Just a
please.
follow-up. So in terms of, as you described, the whole negotiations on backstop,
So please.
what was the problem actually? I mean, Theresa May wasn't able to do proper consultations with the different groups within her party and outside the party, so that she could build a political consensus in House of Commons for her to be passed.
Please.
I'm General Sani. I just want to ask you an issue that keeps coming to my mind. You mentioned about that you haven't. I mean, we know how the Constitution. It's more of conventions. With the changing demographic profile and what's happened in the last about few years, is there time for the UK to really put down a constitution and written order? Because I think there's a changing demographic pattern. People's value systems are changing. People's understanding of issues is colored by the own vision where they come from, and that actually will have a great impact. I mean, we've seen some incidents that have happened where this has been an issue. So I mean, it's a very generic question. If you'd like to answer that, I'd be delighted to hear.
Yes. Well, let me just quickly say, for the last quarter of a century, I have been arguing for a written constitution for the UK. A quarter of a century ago, as far as I know, I was the only Conservative Member of Parliament who took this view, and one of very few members of Parliament of any persuasion. It is now becoming, if not a majority view, quite a large number of people. And the events of the last few months have been indicating the massive problems of not having a constitution in our country. We wrote quite a good constitution for Germany in the basic law. We exported people who wrote quite a good constitution for the United States. We've been quite good at inventing other people's constitutions, but we've been very bad at inventing a constitution for ourselves.
We're willing to help.
Sorry?
We are willing to help.
Well, we may need some help from you. You have quite a good constitution. We're quite good at enforcing the constitution we don't have, but we're not very good at having one. Maybe you have the opposite problem to some extent.
The longest one in the world.
But no, look, I think we have an issue we're going to have to address. Not quickly, because you don't write constitutions if you're sensible in 5 minutes, but over time. Your question about how it was that the previous Prime Minister failed to get a majority composed of her own members of Parliament in favour of compromise is going to be one of the things that people are going to write a lot of books about. And I think it's the kind of history that Louis Namier favoured. You'd have to go through the precise relationships between her and various specific individuals and what went wrong. And it's a very interesting question, but it's a great failure of statesmanship, for sure. I think had it been done very quickly, it could have been done much more easily. Part of it was about a long delay and people getting into entrenched positions. But there are many other features of the scene, and they make a very interesting book. I just want to say quickly this thing to make an observation about the security and intelligence sharing, because I think defence and intelligence sharing is a very important issue. I sat for 6 years on the National Security Council. In the entire time, we never had a discussion about UK-EU intelligence sharing or defence. We had many discussions about bilateral relationships with France, which are intensely important. NATO, Five Eyes.
Five Eyes.
Intelligence sharing with the United States in particular, which is a crux of the relationship, and indeed, while we're at it, defence relationships, for example, with India. So the European defence arrangements were enormously important to us, but they were conducted on a bilateral basis with major European powers and not with the EU, and I think will continue to be so. And so far as the intelligence sharing is concerned, which is more important, I think, even than the defence relationship, I agree with the Ambassador entirely about that, actually, part of the point of having an orderly withdrawal is it's perfectly possible to replicate the intelligence sharing arrangements as long as you do so in a spirit of compromise, amity, and so on. What causes the problem is not leaving the EU or being part of the EU. What causes the problem is if there's antagonism and friction, and then it takes time to sort these things out. In the long run, the interest both of the UK and of EU member states in having appropriate intelligence sharing is so great that I think that those relationships will be knitted back together again. But the question is whether there's a disruption for a period before they get knitted back together again.
So just to finish off, sir, to you a question about the future. Same to you, sir. Let me quote Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He says, as we come out of the EU, we are going up a gear. We are going to take advantage of all the freedoms that Brexit can give, whether that is new tax allowance for investment or speeding up public procurement contracts. So you've served in London. If this happens, once it happens, where do you see the greatest opportunities for UK and India to work together in certain sectors, in specific sectors, in a post-Brexit phase?
I think definitely one area is going to be in the whole area of finance. The City of London and more generally British financial institutions as a vehicle both for raising funds for India's development. I read somewhere today that the masala bonds are actually raising more rupees outside India than some of our bigger funds are raising within the country. That is one. The second is in technology and education, science, technology. This is something on which both our governments have bilaterally and without any hype managed to keep alive despite everything that's happening in Britain, and that's a very, very important area. The third is an area where we haven't, I think, concentrated enough effort, but I hope if Brexit forces a change of view among some of the big companies, is in defense manufacturing. This is an area in which Britain is still very strong. Don't get the wrong impressions that they are big players there. They are still very strong in this, and they, I think, would benefit from building kind of relationships with India, which is going to need a whole lot more defense and defense industry on its own soil before long. I put these three as the big ones. Fourth, of course, generally the global discourse keeping democracy alive. Because don't forget, when we talk about these anti-immigration forces and anti-sovereign forces and so on, these are realities which we have to accommodate. But one needs to understand that the opposite side is not motivated only by lack of jobs. There are issues of religion, there are issues of race,
Political culture,
which, at least as democratic societies, certainly one of the things we need between India and Britain is far more think tank exchanges and discourses, and some of this should feed into the public domain.
Sir, last word to you, also slightly perspective, if you allow. How do you see, by order of priority, the most important factors tying post-Brexit UK to the EU? On what areas, I assume trade and the basic economic relations, what other areas could the UK and EU work together and show up in the rest of the world as a joint vision for this emerging, uncertain, multipolar order?
Well, I think we've explored many of them. Clearly, the trading relationship and the investment relationship and the financial relationship is the centerpiece. That will, one way or another, have to continue and be opened up and strengthened. Clearly, the intelligence sharing and the defence cooperation are of great importance. While we're at it, there's a large amount of stuff which goes on that nobody really notices, but which matters a lot, to do, for example, with criminal intelligence and control of anti-terrorism and so on. There's a whole series of security-related issues that are sort of domestic security issues that have to be handled and are very important. I think the big question over the next 20 or 30 years is, whatever the relationship is of the UK to the EU, is the ability or inability of the UK and the other major European powers, in whatever form they emerge from all of this, to have a cohesive view of the role of Europe in the relationship between the great moving parts of the world, US, China, India, the rest of Asia, the other BRICS, so on. At the moment, I think it would be fair to say that Europe does not have a foreign policy and never has had a foreign policy. Oh, sorry, when I say never has had, I mean never since the war has had a foreign policy. There was a moment when, for example, Germany had a foreign policy which was called Ostpolitik. That was a real thing. There was a moment when Mrs. Thatcher had a foreign policy which was with Reagan to end the Cold War by defeating the Soviet Union. But if you ask at the moment, what is the strategic 30, 40-year horizon foreign policy of the UK, of France, of Germany, of the EU as a whole, you can't get an answer. That is a major problem for the world, because this is a quarter of the world's GDP we're talking about, and it has to play a role, and it's either going to be a constructive or a non-constructive role, and unless it knows what role it's playing, it's very likely to slip by mistake into a non-constructive role. So that's the really important issue, and that's got to be forged, I think, by the EU countries and the UK, regardless of the relationship of the UK to the EU as an institution, because, as a matter of fact, their interests are almost identical in that respect. Interest and geography mean that actually...
and way of life, if
yes, that too, actually. But I mean, the truth is, in terms of way of life, there's a great deal of similarities we were observing in the session this morning between European countries, India, Japan, and so on, and indeed the US. In terms of political culture, there's quite a long distance between the US and Europe. In terms of economic interest, there's an almost identity of interest between the EU countries and the UK on the one side and the US on the other than particular firms that they may want to promote. But I mean, broadly, it's been operating as one kind of market, indeed with Canada and Australia and so on as well. And the whole interest in the fostering of an open free trading world has been an identity of interest. So the question is, will Europe now find a way of exerting its voice in order to keep the peace between China and the US and enable the whole world, India and the rest of Asia included, to benefit from continued peaceful coexistence? Or are we going to allow the fact of Brexit and the absence of a European foreign policy to mean that if India, China and the US can't sort this out, the Europe doesn't play any role and just lets it all fragment into some kind of ghastly conflagration? And that's the real challenge. And my biggest regret about Brexit is actually it's taken all our eyes off that kind of challenge and diverted them to what is in the end quite a minor issue for the world as a whole.
Well, thank you very
I'll
much.
just add
Yeah.
one
That's
point among the three. The fourth is a maritime dimension. We would very much hope to see a Britain post-Brexit. It is still now playing a bigger role in the oceans of the world. Broadly, I'm not talking only of Navy.
And there are interesting developments even on the maritime security front in the UK and India happening. Sir, thank you for joining us here. It was a short but punchy discussion. So,
Thank you.
particularly to you, thank you so much for joining us for a full day here at Brookings India. We hope to have you back in the
Delighted.
post-Brexit age and in the
Or
book
not.
age, Sir Oliver Letwin author age, when your book is out too. Have a good trip to Bombay and back to London,
Thank
where I'm
you.
sure there'll be agitated days ahead of you. All the best, and please join me in a round of applause to both speakers. Thank you.